Thank you all for joining us today. And before we get started, I would like to tell Charity to introduce us, please.
Hi, my name is Charity. I am the EDI Student Ambassador for Birmingham Scholar. And thank you everyone for coming. Just so everyone knows, this is being recorded and there should be a live transcript available for you guys.
And hello everyone, my name is Shuomi Ige. I'm the EDI Student Ambassador for Medical and Dental School, and I go to the University of Birmingham. We are delighted to welcome you to this event, Looking for Diamonds, as part of LGBT+ History Month. Please don't forget to check out the rest of University of Birmingham's LGBT history program on our website or by following the QR code on the screen. If you have any questions for our guest, please post them in the Q&A box.
Cool. So why Looking for Diamonds? Well, this is the first of two events, and the second is a walking tour for UOB staff and students of Jewelry Quarter cemeteries called Diamonds in the Rough, which takes place on Wednesday, the 15th of February. And in this tour, historians Sheldon Goodman and Sacha Coward unearth the history of LGBT+ figures from Birmingham's queer history. The link to that can be found on our LGBT History Month website if anyone's interested. But why does the history need to be unearthed, and how does one go about finding those diamonds in the rough? Well, we are delighted to welcome both Sheldon and Sacha to this event to answer those questions and more that anyone that may have.
Sheldon and Sacha, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Well, hello everyone. I'm Sheldon K. Goodman. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a historian of many things, death and queerness being two of them. I particularly find as I'm getting older, not that I'm particularly old, but as I'm getting older, I do feel it's important to share the history of our community, to research it, to share it, particularly now, because I think we're all aware that the community is not really, well, it's being kind of attacked from all sides at the moment. We are certainly nowhere near being fully accepted for who we are. And I think as a part of the ongoing thing about accepting who we are, where we came from, we have to know about that kind of stuff. So that's kind of very much my my approach to kind of sharing, researching, and finding out about queer history, because it's validating for me and the community as a whole. So I'm just basically doing it to basically share the enthusiasm with other people who will hopefully come around to kind of my way of thinking.
And hello, my name is Sacha Coward, and my pronouns are also he and him. And I've been working in museums and history now for almost 15 years, which is terrifying. But in particular, my background is in museum work, and I didn't get into museums because of queer history. I got into museums because I like old stuff and I love a good story. But as a gay man working in that environment, just like Sheldon, you kind of find that you end up being an ambassador for a very much underrepresented and underspoken about history, which is the history of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and queer people. So that's become something I've become really passionate about. Now, I met Sheldon just kind of through doing a stand-up comedy night together, as you do. But from there, we've ended up doing tours together of cemeteries. And that's kind of where we've become aligned, very much both of us interested in looking at social history, in looking at the stories of people that tell you a bit of what it was like to be alive at different periods in time. And as Sheldon said, like, to understand who we are today as LGBTQ+ people, we need to know where we came from, and we need to know the people that came before. Now, those people were very different to us. They used different words to describe their identities, which we'll get into. And so it is a complex thing for us to navigate, but it's really rewarding. And I think both me and Sheldon have found on our tours, whether they're in cemeteries, whether they're in museums, wherever, when we have particularly young people from the LGBTQ plus community coming to see their own heritage and realizing that people like them have been around since the dawn of time. That is a powerful moment where past meets present. And I think that's where I found my passion. I'm also required by my publisher to say I'm writing a book. And so I'm writing a book about the queer history of folklore called Queer as Folklore. And if you Google Queer as Folklore, you'll find it and you can pre-order a copy. Sorry, got to say that, required to do that. But that's our passion. And that's kind of what brought us to this project.
That's great. Thank you so much, both of you. So could you tell us a bit more about Diamonds in the Rough and how it came about?
So Diamonds in the Rough came about primarily actually as a result of the initial project that we did whilst working together. So down in London, there was a project that going on by a cemetery volunteer for Brompton Cemetery. Brompton Cemetery is a royal park. It's also part of a historic network of historic cemeteries called the Magnificent Seven. And essentially, it was a project that was created to look at the LGBTQ dead that were buried in the cemetery. And I was brought on essentially to help navigate the research process. How do you package these stories? So obviously you can talk about their lives. You can do a graveside tour. You know, stand by the headstone. This is who this person was. But you have to kind of contextualize it. You have to adequately describe it and obviously say a little bit more about the world in which these people would have lived, as Sacha has already said, using words such as gay, bisexual. Yeah, these are modern words. These are not words that historic people would have used themselves. So I was brought in, and then as a result, I kind of I thought, well, actually, I know somebody who I saw at a comedy stand-up gig very recently who does a kind of lot of this work as well. I wonder if he'd be interested in joining me. So we kind of got together and we put this event together, and essentially it kick-started, I'd call it a movement, essentially looking at the LGBTQ dead in cemeteries across the country. So we did one, a similar one called Drop Dead Gorgeous in Arnos Vale Cemetery. And then about I think it was 2 years ago, when Josie Wall, who was the cemetery kind of liaison manager, events coordinator, got in touch, essentially wanting someone to do the same for their cemetery. You know, they were a very merry band of cemetery researchers and volunteers. As far as I'm aware, not many came from the community. And although they were open to talking about and sharing these stories, they didn't necessarily know quite how to do it. Again, in much the same way that Royal Parks and Brompton Cemetery did. So they brought us on board to see what we could find within Key Hill and Warstone Lane cemeteries. And it was a surprise because a lot of these stories, as we'll extrapolate as this webinar goes on, they aren't immediately accessible. They aren't there, you know, in a book, like, you know, open it. Oh, look, there we go, evidence there and then. Key Hill was slightly different. It was actually, it didn't take that much, you know, kind of, you know, scratching beneath the surface, for want of better kind of terminology, to actually find these stories. So essentially, that's kind of, you know, roughly how it came about.
Yeah, I think that the thing that through time, through working at different cemeteries, me and Sheldon have sort of learnt on the job a bit. Like, we're both historians, we're both researchers, we've both done tours before, but there is a unique combination of skills in exploring LGBTQ plus history. As Sheldon said, we'll get onto why that is so hidden and why it can be so challenging. But like Almost Queerly Departed, which was the project we did at Brompton, and Drop Dead Gorgeous, were like, you know, cutting our teeth and learning how to find these stories, how to talk about them respectfully, how to, you know, allay some of the concerns that people have when you talk about people who died 200 years ago and you're bringing them to life in a sense today for a contemporary LGBTQ plus audience.
Thank you. As we mentioned, unearthing LGBT plus history can be a challenge. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, I mean, one of them is the reasons is really obvious. So historically, LGBTQ plus people, and just to be clear, that means lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer. And I will be using the term queer as an umbrella term just because LGBTQ plus is a mouthful. If we want to talk about why I use that word and how I use that word, I'm happy to discuss that at the end in the Q&A. But for queer people in the past, even though they didn't use those terms, people who love people of the same gender, people whose gender identity didn't fit the norms of their society, these were people who generally hid their stories. These are not people who could publicly love and publicly live. So if they were writing love letters to each other, they're letters that may have been burnt after they died, or if they had spoken to each other in secret communities, they wouldn't want people to know about it because they could be arrested, they could be murdered, they could lose their livelihoods. Generally, things don't go well for queer people before the 1990s who were out and proud. So for this reason, this is a history actively hidden by the people living it, not because they were necessarily ashamed of who they were, but because that was how you survived. So you're looking for a history that people almost didn't want to exist written on paper, out and proud. The other big challenge I find is the understanding what constitutes a lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans identity 100 or 200 or 300 years ago. These are contemporary words. These are modern words, some of them more so than others. The word gay, for example, used to describe a man who is romantically attracted to other men, has some history to it. The same with lesbian. It originates from Lesbos, which is the ancient Greek island where Sappho wrote her poetry. But these are terms that in common use would not have been spoken about in the 1800s. A woman who was attracted to other women would not be calling herself a lesbian in 1795 or 1820. A man we might describe as gay today would not be using that word, and a trans man or woman would not be understanding their identity in the same way. So one of the challenges is drawing these lines. And one of the pushbacks we often get is, should you be doing that? It is a complex one that hopefully we'll pick apart a bit more in this conversation. But what we will do is, if we go to a headstone of someone who's buried, we won't go there and go, this is Anna Letitia Waring, a lesbian, because that's inaccurate. That is not correct. And in a sense, it's not respectful. What we can say is, this is Anna Letitia Waring, of which we have the following evidence to show that she was a passionate lover of other women, that she wrote poetry, lovely, beautiful poetry for other women. And at the end of her life, people actively burnt her correspondence to hide this about her identity. Today, if she was alive, she might have defined as a lesbian or a bisexual woman. We cannot say, but at least you're drawing a parallel. You're not saying that these people fit into the molds of contemporary society, but you're saying that there is a connection worth drawing. So for me, those are the two biggest challenges. What do you think, Sheldon? Any other things that spring to mind?
I mean, I think you basically covered it there, to be honest. It's just that it's that case of, yeah, knowing that a lot of people don't want this history to be spoken of. And again, we've encountered that in a fair bit in the work that we've done, which actually galvanizes me to basically go, well, okay, that's what you think. I disagree. Here we go. And it kind of just pushes me further on to actually kind of refute their almost like hostility. And that's the other thing as well, the actual open hostility, even now, even in 2023, when it comes to actually talking about these histories. And it's his hostility that comes from a place you wouldn't ordinarily expect it to come. It's certainly not from the community. It's from gatekeepers of heterosexuality. I'd say they're probably the biggest ones. And again, it's just like a red flag to a bull, as far as I'm concerned. As soon as someone does that to me, I'm like, oh, all right, here we go. You're not going to stop me, because this is important and we should absolutely know about it.
We've never had anybody come on our tours and walk up to us afterwards and say, that was offensive, that was incorrect, why are you doing this, this is wrong. What we get occasionally are Facebook comments by anonymous people from Texas who are never going to come to Birmingham to one of our tours, who are literally, they are online, and we know these people, we all use the internet, who will just be searching LGBT, gay, just to find anything to get angry about. So there is, like, if we're talking about Venn diagrams, the people who get angry about the work we do are a circle over here. The people that actually engage with our work, who go on the tours, who read what we write, that's a circle over here. They don't overlap at all. So yeah, there is a manufactured outrage that can happen, and that can be challenging, because Nobody likes to log online, and even if it is and it is a minority, it is such a minority, but even if it is 0.1% of someone who's calling you slurs, who's saying horrible things about your identity, who you are, about the people that you've been researching, that can also be really difficult too.
Thank you both for that. That's really interesting. And sort of based on what you said prior and like how much depth you go into like describing people, is there any stories that you found on people that you found particularly fascinating or interesting or anything like that?
So, I mean, I would say come on the tour. I'm not going to give you the full list of who we've researched because it's much better in person. But of the people we've looked at, one person that really resonates is Anna Letitia Waring. I mentioned her earlier. So she's a hymnologist, as in she wrote hymns and studied hymns, so songs that would be sung in churches. She's a relatively well-respected hymnologist. She appears in a few different collections, and for some reason, some of her hymns ended up being really popular in America. Now, for such a kind of godly woman, a woman who's clearly devoting herself to religion, this is not someone who was, quote, an out and proud lesbian. That would be an incorrect description of who she was. What we can gather is that Anna preferred the company of women. Her friends, her people that she worked with commented that she preferred the company of women. And in one of her final pieces, she writes a devotional piece that is written to her beloved, who is another woman. We don't know who this woman is, but we can think of a number of women who she lived and traveled with. Her writing shows a way of talking about God and religion that always puts the feminine first rather than the masculine, which is really interesting for that time, and is quite romantic. She's not someone that was ever seen or was with men, but she put her love that maybe she couldn't express elsewhere into these poems. Now, she ends up being put onto a list online. It's an American list by a Christian fundamentalist website, which talks about people who have written hymns that you should not listen to because they are demonic or sacrilegious. And she appears on this list twice. One for being a woman, what a sin, being a woman who's written hymns, and the second for being a lesbian. Now, I wouldn't even describe her necessarily as a lesbian, but this is from looking at her life, what people have described. Now, through exploring her writings and doing this work, we were able to find some more of her songs, some of which have poetry that has fallen a bit out of fashion. One of which is a poem which talks about a burnt love letter, and it is written to her. And that for me was really beautiful and profound, to find someone writing a piece that maybe she kept for herself, but something that was expressing a love that she couldn't express otherwise in her life. At the end of her life, her writings, she had many letters that she wrote between her and other women. And the woman who basically collected these together to write an autobiography, quote, says that many of the writings were not fit for publication, and so she burnt them. Now, this was probably not done as a cruel attack on Anna Letitia. It was probably to try and this is in the 1800s we're talking, so to preserve her innocence. It would have been a scandal if these intimate letters had come out, but it is tragic that in trying to protect her character, we've actually lost a lot of those stories. We worked with a poet, a queer poet called Kate Lyons, who looked at the research that we've done into Anna Letitia Waring and created a poem herself based about Anna, but also about the queer people, the queer women visiting the cemetery today, the young teenagers holding hands, all of this kind of stuff, and brought it all together. And the poem was so powerful, it made me cry. So that's Anna. That story, I think, is really beautiful.
I mean, for me, I'd probably say one of the ones, probably my favourite kind of queer story that I've kind of come across is the Ernest Thesiger. And he was one of the first that we came up for Queerly Departed in Brompton. I love him because he was someone who wasn't afraid to be himself at a time when there was huge pushback and awareness of what it meant to be a gay man. I mean, whether he would have used that term in his own lifetime, doubtful. But he was someone who came from military and came from a very powerful Victorian family, lots of colonial kind of interests going on. You know, people, you know, the Thesigers went out to explore and conquer the world essentially. And when he was born, you know, it was almost like he was born in a ballroom dress. It was just like he was almost like a complete gear change for how the family was supposed to operate and be perceived as. And he was someone who had no interest in going into the military world or empire or anything like that. He wanted to be an artist. So he enrolled at the Slade School of Art. And while he was there, he met a handsome young chap who he fell desperately in love with. But then, for reasons unknown, and yeah, again, you know, there's very little archival evidence to suggest why he did this. He ends up marrying this guy's sister. Whether he wants to give the pretension that, you know, he was a heterosexual male, or, you know, again, he was trying to adhere to some sort of social standard that was expected of him, we don't know. But it was so shocking to his amour that he shaved his head in protest. He was just like, what is this, Ernest? This is quite bizarre. I thought we had something here. But he would go on, and again, he became a fabulous painter. But that's not what he was essentially known for. He was actually known for his roles in film and acting, and particularly in the 1920s, 1930s. He was known as a horror movie actor, particularly probably his best known role in 1935's The Bride of Frankenstein, where he is directed by James Whale, who himself is, again, using a modern term, probably would have identified as a bisexual man. So again, he's kind of, there is discussion about how he got the role. Again, he was a member of a community that would have known each other at the time. And again, he plays this role. And if any of you have ever seen The Bride of Frankenstein, it is one of the most remarkable films that's ever been made, coming up to nearly 100 years now. And he basically plays the role, it's the sequel of Frankenstein, which came out a few years beforehand. And he plays the role of Dr. Septimus Pretorius, who is Dr. Frankenstein's teacher, his mentor, and also kind of like older friend. And he plays it essentially as a Campole queen. It's wonderful. It's absolutely hysterical when you see it. And, you know, there's so much flourish and kind of, to see it on film in the 1930s, there wasn't much it was literally, he was just presenting it on film for you. There was no hiding it. It wasn't so much he was playing a role. He was being himself. He was one of those actors who basically played a role for whatever role he was actually kind of supposed to be portraying at the time. And, you know, whenever he was in indignation at whatever Frankenstein had done or Dr. Frankenstein had done on screen, he would, you know, the nostrils would flare and he'd give her like a deep in breath. And it was just like, this is, you know, if you're thinking about the 1930s at the time, the world is heading to a very dark place. But the events of the 1940s are very, very much on the horizon. And you see this wonderful masterclass in queerness and campness on screen. It is such a wonderful thing to see. And this, you know, this is very much how Ernest Thesiger basically held himself, even until his dying days in the early 1960s. The story that, again, one of my favourite ones is that one day he decided to go to the pub in Chelsea, because he lived in a pub in Chelsea. And again, you know, Chelsea at that time wasn't as bougie as it is today. It was very kind of rough and ready. You had the Lotts Road power station, the docks. It was quite a working class district. So he went into a pub and he decided to do needlework in the middle of this pub full of very rough, very masculine men. And there he is, you know, with his needlepoint, and he was a fabulous needlework. You know, he exhibited like chairs and stuff that he made. And there's these guys who would come up to him and go, oh, you know, using slurs against him. And he'd very, you know, casually go, yes, I suppose I am. I'm also the stitching bitch of Chelsea. Now buzz off. And, you know, this is a guy he was an older gentleman, and there were these rough types. And the fact that he stood up for them, or he stood up for himself, very, very plainly in front of them. He was a force to be reckoned with. He would walk down the streets, you know, with painted nails. You know, sometimes he put like a blue rinse in his hair just to show off a bit. He was someone who could be himself. But this is the other thing that I think is really interesting about him. He was a member of the upper class. So to a certain extent, his social standing actually gave him a layer of protection where, say, if he was a regular a docker, a labourer, a general labourer, you wouldn't get away with that. Absolutely not. So you see this, you know, this man, he was out and out. He was very much an out man, being himself at a time where the hostility to such things in public was so hugely frowned upon. I mean, again, I think he's just a fabulous man. And you can watch YouTube videos of him, and you can see him there in all his magnificence. Someone who didn't really give a flying fig what people thought of him, and I really do admire that. I really do. So yeah.
Thank you so much for those beautiful stories. They're very interesting. I find both of them very, very bold of people back then. Of course, you're doing this work in the context of so-called culture wars at a time of increasing pushback against the LGBT plus community. Have you had any negative experiences because of this, or has it impacted your work in any way?
We'll go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, sadly, yes. But it's complex because in my actual tours, the actual work that I do with the LGBT community, I've never had a single person walk up to me and say, like, no, I don't like it, that's offensive, that's wrong. I've had people give feedback, everyone has different opinions on history, but I've never had what I would call negative feedback. What I will briefly mention, it tends to happen outside of this, and I'd say that social media is a hellscape. It is a hellscape for this kind of stuff. It's deeply unpleasant. I want to also note that within the culture war, we're not just talking about queer people. We are also talking about women, people of color, any kind of representation in history that is not white, straight, cis, male, is you get backlash, and some of it can be deeply unpleasant. And when we were doing the tours in Birmingham last year, I totally unrelated to the tours themselves. I was walking around talking about the wonderful queer people in the cemetery. I ended up being quoted in an article, of all things, about Viking sexuality, totally different branch of history. But for 2 days, I had to close my social media accounts because I was receiving such a barrage of deeply unpleasant stuff. And it's rare. It doesn't happen all the time. And I wouldn't want to put off any person that wants to go into queer history, because largely it's a really joyous space. Like, I love my job and I'm surrounded by people who are just supportive and excellent. But occasionally, as you said, the culture war will have this backlash. And I would really say that, having done it in like queer history for a long time, the thing that really gets on my nerves, really gets to me, is the hypocrisy, like the amount of hypocrisy. So as an example, I am asked if I say that so-and-so had relationships with other men, or this woman was attracted to men and women, or this person's gender identity did not conform with the one they were born and identified as. I'm asked to show so much proof, like show the receipts, prove everything, show all you're working out. No, it's not, you can't prove it, you're making it up, it's in your head. Yet, if I go on a tour of the Tower of London and someone tells me about, I don't know, Henry VIII or whatever, they can say whatever they bloody like, because cis heterosexual history is seen as normal. It's seen as okay. It's the status quo. Whereas if I even implicate for a second that someone is anything other than cisgender or heterosexual, I need to come with the receipts. I need to basically almost do the equivalent of taking a UV scanner over the bed. I need to show soiled bed sheets. Even if I show a love letter, someone will say, well, maybe they were just friends. Even if I show like the most clear evidence, Ernest Fezziger is a fantastic example, there will still be people that go, yeah, but you can't really say that. The burden of proof is so heavy, whereas for any other historian working on standard cisgender heterosexual history does not need to provide that kind of burden of proof. And I would say that you can end up internalizing this. You become really paranoid as a historian that you're going to be called out for making things up, for being a quote, a revisionist, just because you're talking about people that aren't straight and or aren't cisgender. And I know that Black historians have this problem, women historians have this problem, people that explore the history of disabled people, people with disabilities, have the same thing, that you have to do so much more work just to create the space to even have that conversation. And even then, it's not always seen as real history. It's seen as a kind of fun, weird, like that's your pet project. Go ahead, sweetheart, but no one really believes it. And that can be really frustrating. Now, just to briefly reiterate, the majority of responses I get are fantastic. The majority of historians I work with who are heterosexual and cisgender are supportive and on it and amazing. But it's just the odd 1% that can sometimes get through your armor, and on a bad day, it can really pull you down. So that's the negative. What do you think, Sheldon?
I mean, I'd say I've been quite lucky in the sense that I've not encountered much negativity myself personally. Of course, don't read the comments. I mean, that just goes without saying in some particular ones. But I'd probably say the biggest negative I have encountered personally is the gatekeeping within the community, because of course within our own community there is a huge amount of homophobia, particularly from older members of the community. And I'm not saying that that's it's not great. I can understand why it's there. But particularly when you want to discuss things like Queerly Departed, like Drop Dead Gorgeous, like Diamonds in the Rough, and you try to speak to people who are of the community themselves, and you want them to engage with the conversation. You want to open up spaces, what might be a church, might be a cemetery, might be whatever. And you know that there is a history of queerness there, and there's just a resolute, complete lack of interest because they do not want to open up that, what they perceive to be, can of worms. And it's really disappointing when you hear that, because you're thinking we're not going to do a hatchet job. You're not going to just kind of set fire to a firework and run away as soon as it blows up. That's not queer history. That's not what we do. And it's on several occasions I've come up against this where really interesting stories, interesting narratives, really interesting life stories have been there, just ready to be to be shaped and to kind of shared and so on. And the custodians, the guardians have just gone, no, pull the ladder up behind them, no interest in talking about it whatsoever. And you're thinking, well, surely actually we're doing whoever's story this is an injustice by not talking about it. And even that argument is not really considered. It's like, well, that might be the case, but we have no interest in actually entertaining or talking about it.
Yeah, I think it's a really complex one, and probably, for those of you who are allies, you may not be aware of this, and those who are in the LGBTQ plus community, you're probably very aware of this, that we have our issues within this community. So we have racism, misogyny, all of the stuff that you would imagine happens within the LGBT community as well. Sadly, we're not perfect. I mean, we try to be, but we're not. And because of that, you can sometimes be really surprised, to use a horror movie analogy, when the call comes from inside the house, when you are experiencing homophobia from a gay man, which is it's a really complicated thing to have to deal with. And I would say as well, as part of that, for a long time, looking at I'm going to speak myself as a white middle class able-bodied gay man, like you're probably sick to death of hearing people like me talking about diversity, but for a lot of time, historians who are LGBT historians do come from a background like me. And that means we get a lot of Oscar Wilde. We get, there are certain people, and they're always white gay men that we hear about. And some of these stories are great. They're amazing. Don't get me wrong. Oscar Wilde, fascinating character. Alan Turing, fascinating story. But it does mean that there isn't a push to explore diversity within that. So people of color who are queer, women who are queer. I'd also add, in terms of gatekeeping, that there is a real issue that we have where, because we are, as a community, are starved of representation, we tend to cling on to it. So you'll have the case of people fighting tooth, nail and claw over whether a historical figure was gay or bisexual, was a lesbian or a trans man, was non-binary or trans, where do they fall on the contemporary spectrum? Who gets to own this story? And that can be really frustrating, because a lot of the time we just can't say, this person could be this way, they could be that way. To be honest, they didn't use any of those words. So why can't we all own it? I think of a contemporary example of Freddie Mercury from Queen, right? There is battles online over whether Freddie was bisexual or gay. And I understand why both communities feel this sense of wanting to own him. But to be honest, as part of a bigger queer community, can we let the person talk for themselves, see where that story takes us, and also just because I'm a gay man, if Freddie Mercury is bi, that doesn't mean we're not connected, because as a community, we're all connected. So that's another pet peeve of mine.
Thank you both. That is really, really important, especially like trying to keep it diverse and unearthing like sort of more niche stories. So I think based on that, what do you think that the LGBT plus community and the allies can do to ensure that stories like the ones that you've told continue to be told?
I think ensuring that, well, two things that I'd say. Number one, ensuring that they get told regardless. I don't care what's going on in the world. I don't care if there's any kind of, oh, well, you shouldn't be talking about that, or if there's some sort of thing or pressure, you know, like potentially reintroducing Section 28 or whatever it might be in the political sector. Never mind that. You keep on telling those stories and you don't give a damn about what else is going on at the time. You have to push through, because otherwise those stories will be lost. And particularly, again, we're in the, you know, in the tour guides, storytellers, historians, whatever you want to call us. We can only ever capture a small fragment of that person or what they're about or what they experienced or what they did. So yeah, if you suddenly just kind of like down tools and go, you'll roll over, not that I'm saying that anyone would for a moment, that's when you start kind of admitting defeat with it. And frankly, that's why I'm thinking, well, yeah, never mind that. You just keep carrying on. You keep carrying on. I'll do it in my own way, or Sacha do it in his way. Other people do it in their way as well. As long as you keep sharing those stories, then it will continue. I think also as well, another thing that the community can do, and this is an ongoing thing, Sacha's already touched on it, is ensuring that the other letters in the acronym are fairly represented. And I think particularly, you know, G does tend to dominate. It does actually annoy me. And again, Alan Turing's a fantastic man, and he went through terrible stuff, absolutely horrific suffering for his achievements. But I am beginning to see that he's being trotted out every Pride Month, every LGBT History Month, almost like Christmas decorations, and it's really annoying me, because it's a disservice to him. It's disrespectful, and also it just shows that there is a whole world of queerness that isn't being talked about, because it's almost like people are deliberately going for the low-hanging fruit. Not that I'm saying that he's low-hanging fruit, but it's just that kind of, it's the ease of it. And I think, you know, and even in Pride events, in Pride Month, you look at how much gay events there are, and you look in the community of how lesbians tend to be looked at, how many lesbian events are going on, how much bisexual events are going on, how much transgender. It's just, there is an imbalance. So I think as well, just going forward, not only, as I said, actually making sure the stories are told, but ensuring balance. Balance is absolutely key when actually respecting our own histories, our own experiences, our own narratives, really. So I'd say, yeah, those would be my two big ones.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Sheldon, and I guess I'd add to this, and what you were saying was do it anyway. Well, it's February, that's LGBT History Month, and that's lovely, and me and Sheldon are very popular for a month, and then we suddenly get popular again for Pride. I'm sure people of colour know this when it comes in the UK to October for Black History Month, and women in March when it's Women's History Month. And yeah, like those are fantastic. I'm not going to rally against LGBT History Month, because to have a focus in today's society is integral and important. But like, it's just history. It is history. It is a particular kind of history, and it takes nuance, and it's been underrepresented for far too long. But it is also just history. And I think maybe some cisgender heterosexual allies, maybe you're scared, and I understand, of like saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing, or, you know, stepping out of bounds or owning something that isn't yours. But LGBT history is your history. You can go on an LGBT history tour, because even if you are not queer yourself, you are part of the human story, and so were queer people. So it's all part of the same thing. So to my allies, if you are looking at, I don't know, the history of Victorian fashion, are you looking at LGBT history within that? Are you looking at Black history within that? Are you looking at the history of disabled people? Because you have an opportunity, no matter what the topic, even when it's not February, even when there's no rainbow banner on it, to do that work and to take the extra step. I would say the other thing is, like, even though it may sound like the counterpoint, don't be afraid, but also do talk to us, do talk to the community before you go out there. I am going to call out a particular institution, the British Museum, who put out a tweet for LGBT History Month, showing an artifact called the Warren Cup, which depicts a man and an underage child having sex, and putting that out on LGBT History Month. Like, no, you don't do that. Like, let's just consult with the community. Let's think about what message we're saying. Now, I imagine the person who did that was not trying to do a horrible thing, was not trying to imply that the LGBT community are all pedophiles. I'm sure they were not trying to do that. It was a mistake, and possibly an honest mistake, but a really damaging mistake. Now, I'm a white dude. If I'm going to do something relating to Black history, you can guarantee at the very least I am talking to Black historians. Ideally, I'm stepping out the frame and letting someone else come in and do that work for me because they understand the community. So it's this dual thing of don't be scared, get involved, platform us, come to the tours, think about the topics. The other side, before you jump into it, just talk to the community. We're so excited to be involved, but do make sure you do your due diligence before you do something that is foot in mouth, and you will have the community going, what the hell are you doing? Because there are sensitivities, there are living people who are living during a time that is really challenging. And queer history can be empowering and supportive and interesting. And if it's misused, it can make people feel terrible. So it is really important to do that due diligence.
Thank you for sharing that story. That's quite horrifying to hear. And I agree very much with Sheldon talking about how easy it is to celebrate one person over and over again, necessarily picking like the easiest way out of being knowledgeable and understanding other people's points of view, understanding other people's history. And yeah, so another question is, do you have a favorite character from LGBT history? Who are they and why do they interest you?
I'm gonna go first. I'm gonna go for one that I don't think a lot of people have heard of. I just got cramp in my leg. So awful moment to suddenly get cramp in your leg. Let me go for it. Sorry. So Barbara Gettings is the person I'm choosing, and she was a librarian, not an often a profession that you hear associated with like radical queer politics. But Barbara was amazing. So she was a lesbian woman living during the 70s and 80s. And she was really passionate in America about trying to fight the fact that homosexuality was in the clinical list of diseases. So for a long period of time, if you had an illness, particularly a mental illness, so we're talking like schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, those things we talk about today, alongside those was homosexuality, which was seen as an illness. It was something that was believed to be a mental illness and could be treated and could be cured. Now, we now know today that homosexuality cannot be treated. It cannot be cured. It should not be cured. In fact, doing so is what is officially described as torture. So you can't do that to a human being. And it is just a way of being. It's just a way of existing, and people have existed that way since the dawn of time. But Barbara was a passionate instigator to try and stop this. So what she did is she got her best mate or a good friend who was a psychologist and a psychiatrist who was also a gay man, but he was quiet about it. He would have lost his job if he'd been open about being a psychologist and gay, because under that listing, he would have had a mental illness. And at that point in time, you weren't allowed to practice psychology if you had a mental illness. So she encouraged him to put on a Richard Nixon mask, like a plastic mask, go to the official conference for American psychologists and basically call himself Dr. X, so he didn't have to reveal his identity. And basically he starts this speech, which is, I am a psychologist, I am a gay man, and explains how being gay is not a mental illness. But she was the person behind the scenes. Now, when he speaks about it, he says he would never have done it if she hadn't put him up to it. And one of the reasons I love Barbara is she was involved with all kinds of protests. She's a great example of how the community helps people outside their own identity. So what I mean is the example of lesbian women donating blood during the HIV crisis, mainly affecting gay and bisexual men. You know, gay men campaigning for rights for lesbian women. I love seeing that like group intersection. She was helping the gay male community like get rights, knowing that this fight for any individual group or person was a fight for all of us. So I think that's why I think that's really important. Today, I do get worried sometimes that we get pushed off and siloed into our little LGBTQ plus, and sometimes even forced to fight against each other, when I think as a single community, we are at our strongest. So yeah, she's my hero. What about you, Sheldon?
So probably my hero, again, a guy who's, I must admit, I'm quite shocked I didn't know about him before, but I found out about him as a result of some work that we did for the Brunel Museum, where we did a walking tour of the River Thames looking at queer history. And this is a, you know, for want of a better word, a visionary, frankly, a filmmaker, an artist, a creative wonder by the name of Derek Jarman, who was, you know, he was originally started out his early career as a set designer. So focusing on films like Ken Russell's The Devils, which I think came out in 1971. But his best known film is Jubilee, which came out in 1978. And it kind of shone a light to punk and indeed kind of historical. It was his first foray into using historical concepts and themes to explore the idea and presence of queerness in everyday community. So another project he worked on as a result of this, again, go on YouTube, watch it. It's a fantastic, visually, it's an assaulting film. It's a wonderful thing to see. He would later go on and make a historical film about Edward II, probably one of our lesser known monarchs. Edward II is probably one of those monarchs who historically, there is a question mark over his true orientation. Again, you know, using modern terms to describe how he probably interacted with his kind of his close partners, certainly his favourites. The lovely Piers, Galveston. But what Derek did was that he was using his own experiences as a gay man to try and shed light on historical examples of queerness, and basically using it as a mirror to repression and homophobia that was very dominant and prevalent in the 1970s and the 1980s, which he was finding whenever he was trying to market work, or indeed even be himself. So I think for the fact that he was kind of using history in that way as a mirror to society, I think is such a wonderful idea as well. And also the other thing that really kind of, you know, kind of like completely sidesweeps me about him is that he was probably one of the openly honest and frank people about their own HIV diagnosis in the 1980s. He was diagnosed on the 22nd of December 1986. And whereas a number of people, you know, they kept the diagnosis to this killer disease as it was then to themselves, he, a month later, was going on television and talking about it quite openly in interviews. I think I remember one of the interviews he did with a guy called Jeremy Isaacs, and you can watch this interview online. It's called Face to Face. And he's basically saying how his own consultant, his own HIV/AIDS consultant in London, was saying, yeah, I'm dealing with about 50 patients who are in exactly the same boat that you are. You are the only one talking about it. Because no one was, of course, back then. It was a hugely frightening thing for the community to be going through. And again, if any of you have seen It's a Sin, you know, again, you know, that great series that was on Channel 4 the other year. And coincidentally, he did the music video for It's a Sin by the Pet Shop Boys. So again, there's a link as well. But he was openly talking about his diagnosis, and actually, you know, the fact that we aren't talking about it is completely feeding the stigma. We absolutely, yeah, I'm an out and out gay man, and yes, I have it. And he was presenting it very matter of factly. And again, the interview itself is a wonderfully frank bit of televisual history, frankly, because no one else is talking about it in quite the same way that he was. And for the rest of his life, he would be a champion for HIV/AIDS benefits and for concerns and so on. He eventually moved down to Dungeness, where he lived in a kind of little old fisherman's hut, which he also did a beautiful garden for, because he used the garden as a kind of like a bit of therapy, as you know, obviously as he was beginning to succumb to the worst ravages of the disease and so on. But For a visionary like that to use art, music, film, technology to highlight his own sexuality, his own orientation, and also the issues that were facing our community at the time as a mirror to the rest of society in the face of state repression and so on. Oh, good on him. I mean, someone like that, I think he should be, his life should be taught in schools. Absolutely. Fascinating man.
Thank you both. Yeah, I think that's really important. And like, given the time as well, the people that you've spoken about were acting, given like the repercussions they could have faced, yet they did it anyway. I think it's really, really important, especially going forward as well in today's age, to try and like move forward and unearth these stories as well again. And sort of leading on from that, like as a final kind of wrap up question, what would your recommendations be for LGBT history books and like anything of the sort to like get started on researching?
Are you saying in terms of books that you should read, or what we think the book should do?
I think maybe we could do both. Maybe like we could start with like books that you could just read to like intro you into like history. Yeah.
So I would suggest, like a lot of the reading that I do uses Google Scholar. So I would say it's not a book, but it's an incredible resource. If you are university affiliated, that's amazing because it means you can actually access the bloody PDFs, which I always struggle with. But I would look up some stuff there. Now there's two books I'm going to recommend to you. One is called Rum, Sodomy and the Lash. It is a book about LGBT identities at sea and piracy. So if you like pirates and sailors and all that, and you also like queer history, it's really good fun. The title comes from a quote that was said about people that went to sea, that it's all rum, sodomy, meaning basically gay sex, and the lash. I would also recommend a recent book that I've really enjoyed. It is quite controversial, but it's called Bad Gays. And it's a really interesting book because it's actually looking at LGBT people, particularly homosexual people, who did really crap things, who were not nice people, who were not good people. And I really like it because we when we do history of diversity, often, and I understand why, we try to represent all the lovely people, right? We try to make everyone look like a hero, and we go, Alan Turing, wonderful, tragic genius, what a lovely human being, picture perfect. And that's understandable, but I think we're getting to the stage where we can start to say that being gay or being queer does not make you a good person. You can still be a bad person. And I love that this has been written by two gay men, and they're not trying to shame the gay community. They're owning the fact that, like, we've got some baddies among us as well. Like, there are some bad people in the community, and we don't have to like pretend to be picture perfect because we're just like anybody else. The other thing that the book does that I really like is it looks at how being queer or being gay in the past, it could make you like a better person because it could make you learn about diversity. It can make you be a bit more reflective on people who are maligned like you. It can also make you a horrible person. Having traumatic experiences doesn't necessarily make you a really lovely, kind person. So I've really enjoyed that. What about you, Sheldon? What would you recommend?
Two books. I'd say two books, which are I mean, again, particularly when you're looking at queer history, it isn't necessarily rooted in academia. I think we're all aware of that because particularly with the nature of our community, sometimes you have to kind of look at slightly off-piste sources to kind of get the nuggets that you're looking for. So I'd say one of them is a book called Dirty White Boy. And this is a book called, this is a book by a guy called Clayton Littlewood. He's now an author. But originally in the late 1990s, he ran the Dirty White Boy clothing boutique in Soho, London's beating gay heart. And essentially, it was a book that started out on MySpace. Originally, it was a series of blog posts, and it was written in the manner that you would expect from Samuel Pepys. So if you're familiar with Pepys's diaries, you'll know that he goes into intimate detail on his day-to-day activities. once took a boat to Putney, buried his cheese in the backyard, whatever. It's very much of that kind of historical bent, for want of a better word. And essentially what it is that he's writing blog posts about looking after not a massively successful clothing boutique in London's gay district at a time and in the face of commercialization, gentrification, the rise of dating apps. So he's seeing seismic changes in how queer people are interacting on a day-to-day basis, be it because, through Rents or through the likes of Gaydar or Grindr or what have you. And you see, and it is pure poetry on the written page. It absolutely is. Wonderful moments like a Brazilian transgender person coming in to the shop, not because they wanted to buy clothes, but because they wanted to talk to someone about their journey transitioning, because they couldn't talk to anyone else about that. And this is someone who wasn't hiding the fact that they were transitioning, but they couldn't talk about it in the way that they wanted to. Other old characters used to frequent the area in the 50s and 60s who were kind of slightly perturbed about what Soho was turning into. No longer did they feel that it was a safe space for them to go to. They didn't understand it anymore. It wasn't how it was when they were younger. And it's all collected in this narrative. And there's also a second book that he published called Goodbye Soho, where eventually the shop, they have to kind of face facts and realize that they have to move on and they have to go. And again, it's just kind of like a follow-up, in talking about how sex workers and rent boys, what have you, would openly use the space and try and survive and help each other out. So it's a wonderful little peek into the late 90s, early noughties of Soho's gay districts as it was going through a huge change. The other one I would recommend, Queer London. Of course, it's blurred out because that's what Zoom does, isn't it? Matt Holbrook is the author of this book, and a lot of queer history books do stick to London. I'd say that's probably something in the queer community that there is a slight issue with. And again, people like me and Sacha were trying to broaden it out by bringing queer histories to other cities, because it isn't just a London thing. Of course it's not. But this is a really good book because it shows you what was going on in London was going on in Liverpool. It was going on in York. It was going on in other places, stuff like, a cruising etiquette from the 1930s. So, for example, if someone was using a cottage or a public lavatory, of course, these would be targeted for police raids. And so enterprising members of the community, what they would do to get around the fact that they would get raided and have the police kick down the door and found in rather compromising situations with consensual partners, is that they would bring carrier bags. And so what they would do is that they'd have someone sitting on the loo, and then they'd have the person that they were with standing in the carrier bag. So if a policeman pops his head under the door, it looked like he had 2 bags of shopping either side of him. So therefore, it wouldn't actually look like they were up to anything kind of suspicious. And other little tidbits like that, talking about working class happenstance using bathhouses. They weren't going to high-end kind of like saunas and what have you. They were finding same-sex desire in very kind of almost humdrum kind of situations and so on. So it's a really good book in kind of giving you a good kind of peek at London's underbelly, but by and large as well, Birmingham's underbelly, Manchester's underbelly, because a lot of the situations that were happening in London were happening there as well. So I would heartily recommend those 2 books, personally speaking.
Okay, my co-host Charity has had some technical difficulties, sends her apologies, but we're going to go straight into the audience's questions now. The first one says, I'm an American queer and asexual activist writing a book about how asexuality is discussed in queer community print media between 1950 and 2005. I've been collecting resources for this project for 7+ years, but I'm not university affiliated. Any advice for non-university affiliated people for accessing and finding relevant primary sources? I've done hundreds of hours of keyword searches in digitized archives, which I had to find unconventional workarounds to even access. Lots of internet searching, archive.org is great, and visiting multiple physical archives and have hundreds of sources already. So it's likely I found most obvious stuff already. Its sexuality is generally not in metadata, so this has been a difficult search. That's the question.
Yeah, I was going to say that like asexuality, we've not even like touched upon. So the A of LGBTQIA plus, like the plus offered as a stand-in, that really is lacking in historical research. It's really cool to hear that you're looking into that. Firstly, I can tell that that's going to be a real challenge because terminology around asexuality is probably even more hidden than that, referring to kind of, because at least with gay, bisexual and trans, you often have to look up slurs and insults and weird, when it comes to lesbians, I've been looking at tribals a lot recently. So that all these phrases that have fallen out of date, whereas asexuality probably is even more challenging. In terms of accessing the resources, neither me or Sheldon at the moment are university funded or accredited. I know that Sheldon in the past was doing his master's, so had a little bit more access. I'm going to be kind of honest in that this is probably not the right thing to do. I just call on people that are at university to give me access to an article. So I actually will go, like even on Twitter, I've done this and gone, hey, I really want to read this article. Is there anyone I know that can help me find it? And someone will be like, hey, here's a PDF. In terms of, if you're trying to do this long-term research, it's really powerful. I would look to get funding. Yeah. I think like this is such an utilized area. I mean, in the UK, we have like the Arts Council, the Heritage Lottery Fund, possibly even particular archives or groups might help fund that, such as Stonewall. It depends on what they have, but I would look to get funded and then look to get that access officially. Easier said than done, but I think it's great that you're doing it. So yeah, I'd say call on friends or people online who do have university access when you have your particular articles you want to find, and maybe look to get this officially funded, because I think it sounds like a fantastic piece of work.
Okay, next question. Would their letters be burned to protect their identity, privacy, or as a way to erase history? You hear of erasing history, and I want to understand how that practically works.
I think it can be done for all kinds of reasons. So as another example of someone buried in, so this is someone buried in Bristol, John Addington Symonds. He was a gay man who was very open about his sexuality and wrote about it extensively. He kept loads of diaries, and a friend, possibly a lover, it depends, who he wrote backwards and forwards to, asked to have all of his letters sent to him after John died, and then destroyed all the evidence to protect his own identity. Because John had written his diaries about this man's sexuality, and he was terrified of these diaries being published and it coming out that he was gay as well, he destroyed all the journals, which is horrifying. In the case of Anna Letitia Waring, the like her writings were destroyed probably to preserve her dignity. So the person doing it thought they were doing the right thing to protect them. I don't think many people were like, we need to get rid of this gay history when destroying someone's letters. They were probably doing it because they thought it was shocking or dirty. I mean, remember that in the past, this would have been treated like paedophilia, like something shameful, like finding your dead one, your loved one dead in like a really compromising position that you might move them, or you might try to, like, oh, I don't want people to know about that. There are, though, really weird examples where people actively do hide that. So the weirdest example I can think of is some of the studies done on penguins at the Natural History Museum. The writers were writing about how penguins sometimes have sex with other penguins of the same gender, and then sticking the sheets together to hide that information. Or people will use codes to hide their information as well. So there's many reasons why people might do this. I think it's largely to protect themselves, to protect a loved one, or because they think it's indecent and embarrassing. So that's I'd say the reasons why that might happen.
Okay, and we're running out of time, so we can only take one more question. So that's what I'm going to say. Using spaces like cemeteries to tell more diverse stories of the past has potential to change people's sense of place. Is this something you are consciously working towards? And is there any evidence that it can work?
Yes, is the short answer to that. There is, I mean, again, the wider way that cemeteries themselves are being used and seen socially, particularly as a result of lockdown as well, I've been finding, I've been doing, I started off like doing cemetery history before looking into queer cemetery history and queer history as a way. But even over the past 10 years, the way that those spaces have been viewed generally has been seismic. Lots of people 10 years ago, as the old joke goes, wouldn't be seen dead in a cemetery. Ha ha ha. But now that's changing, because when you look at the fact that stones only tell you part of the story, they don't tell you anything useful. Like, who do they fall in love with? What was their favorite hair color? Did they ever go to Sri Lanka? Stuff like that. You don't get that sense of it. And now, because there are projects like what me and Sacha are doing, and what other people, and particularly in the States have got a really, really good, robust queering of cemeteries going on at the moment. There's some wonderful projects going on in places like Atlanta and Greenwood and what have you, where it's because people are deliberately looking for history that is almost running on a tangent of what they've been taught or what's expected to be normal. A lot of more people as a result are actually getting engaged. And so therefore people's use of the space is changing. People feel more welcome going there. They aren't being put off in the way that they would have been a decade or so ago. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, Sacha.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to quote you, Sheldon. You've described cemeteries as being museums of people. And I think there's a really interesting shift to see cemeteries as more than just like spooky backgrounds for your Instagram photos in October for Halloween. They're starting to be seen as like, wow, these are histories of the dead, and that you can do more than just look at the headstones, you can bring them back to life. And because, particularly in big cities, cemeteries are where everyone ends up, that means you've got all kinds of stories, not just Lady and Lord such and such. You have queer people, people of color, working class people. The work needs to be done, but right there is a monument and a representation of the people who really lived and died there. So yeah, I think they are being transformed. And when we've done our tour of Brompton Cemetery, for example, we got LGBTQ plus people to leave flowers at the headstones. So it becomes almost like a ritual as well, like an opportunity, because this is a history that is so hidden and has been so destroyed, that it's a moment to reflect. And in doing that, having a space where the living can contact the dead, not in a supernatural way, but just connect, is really powerful and healing.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for tonight. Please don't forget, if you're a UOB student, to book a spot on the Diamonds in the Rough tour. Places are going very, very quickly. And I'd like to express a huge thanks on behalf of all of us to Sheldon and Sacha for joining us tonight. We really, really enjoyed all the stories you guys had to tell us, and your perspectives and your views. It was interesting and it was absolutely amazing. Do either of you have any projects you'd like to plug besides Sacha's book?
Because my book is in there. That's the only thing I'm going to say. What about you, Sheldon?
Give me a follow on Instagram and on Facebook, Cemetery Club. Look for the skull. Basically doing graveyard stuff, and it's wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you, Shibomi. Thank you, Charity.
Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you both.